Having a Gas is the podcast that talks the great and the good of the creative industries, and in particular finds out what makes great music for film, for TV, for commercials, for dancing to, for cooking to, for f***ing to. Today I'm having a gas with Eric Valentine, a record producer with an enviable track record, producing albums for artists like Queens of the Stone Age, Smash Mouth, Good Charlotte, Maroon 5, Weezer, and many more. That's why I got this SM7 because, you know, you can be bite the mic and there's no reflections, even if you're in a hugely lively room. So.
Yeah, those things are great, man. They're great for radio and great for actually capturing vocals.
Yeah. Do you ever use this mic on records?
All the time. Yeah.
Yeah. Give us some examples.
I love that mic. What's that?
Give us some examples.
Yeah. So the singer for Smash Mouth, SM7 loves his voice. He's got a big, breathy voice with a lot of overtones and stuff. So I use it for all of that. Adam Lazzara for Taking Back Sunday, he was an SM7 guy. I'm trying to think who else was really amazing on the SM7. Black Dahlia from the Dwarves. He was definitely SM7. Who else? Yeah, I know there's some others in there, but there's certain people where just no other mic even comes close, you know?
Yeah.
And I always heard famously that Steven Tyler always used an SM7 and Michael Jackson used an SM7 a lot. Yeah.
I know that Kiedis used it, or Kiedis is it, on Blood Sugar Sex Magic because...
Yeah.
Have you seen the documentary? Is it Funky Monks?
I know I've seen clips from it, and I've seen him, you know, grabbing onto an SM7, singing into it.
Yeah. It's interesting actually because that's Rubin, isn't it? And I think Rick Rubin has I don't know what it is. He's got like a very hands-off approach to producing. But like, how do you think he's managed to achieve this kind of status where everyone loves him and everyone seems to make great records with him?
Well, yeah, I mean, he's a really interesting thing, and he is the opposite of how I approach things, but I still have tremendous respect for what he does and how he approaches them. And I think it really boils down to two things for him. Number one, he hires incredibly gifted engineers and mixers, you know, that help execute his vision. And number two, he really does bring a vision. And that guy knows songs. He knows when songs are right. He knows when they've been captured right. He knows when performances are right. And so he doesn't have to be in the room, you know. He basically creates the opportunity for the musician to do something amazing, but he is the one that gets to choose when it is actually amazing, and he's damn good at it. Yeah,
because I think it was Corey Taylor. Is that right, Corey from Slipknot?
Yeah, I'm not as familiar with I mean, I know the band, but I don't know all the members' names, but yeah.
I'll get slaughtered if I got this wrong, but I think it was him who said he kind of wanted his money back from Rick Rubin because, you know, he said he turned up 3 times during the whole session that was like months long. But it sounds like you're saying a great deal of the art is just setting up the right environment and making the opportunity.
Sure. Yeah, and he may be more hands-on for other things, but from what I've heard, he is very, very involved in choosing the songs that are going to be recorded and deciding when they're really right and when they're done. That's kind of the hardest part, man. Really, like knowing when something is actually done, because anybody can throw up some mics and hit record and get to a place where it's like, okay, all the parts are there. Is this actually really good or not? You know, that can be the hard part. And he's really good at that, you know?
I feel like we are just learning to trust our ears in this studio, in this business, me and Aaron in particular, because we're quite young. I'm not as young as I once was, who is, but, you know, I think we went through this phase, both of us, of we don't like what we're hearing, but we think, oh, well, maybe someone else will, which is a big mistake for the first thing. It's like you have to be convinced by it.
Yeah.
And then there's also the issue of not knowing what to do if it doesn't sound right. And so just throwing plugins on stuff and just sweeping EQs around and things like that. You know, how do you train people ever? And if so, how do you get them to the point where it's knowing what's right or knowing what to do when it's wrong?
Yeah, I've had a long history of having assistants, come through my little world at Barefoot Recording and even places before that. I'm very proud of the fact that a lot of those folks have gone on to have really amazing, successful careers of their own, being producers or songwriters or engineers or mixers and all of that stuff. And I think there's one part of it that I think is maybe can be learned, but a lot of it you just carry with you, which is really what sort of your fundamental instincts are, like what music really speaks to you and that you really connect with in an emotional way. Because I think ultimately the emotional connection is the truest indicator when something is really working. Like you can get all the frequencies in the right place, but if it doesn't feel like something, then it doesn't matter,
Yeah.
And so that's the thing, that I sort of got in tune with for myself at a certain point where it's like, I use a spectrum analyzer and I'll look at stuff and, try and line up all the frequencies and I'll A/B to other things and, do all this stuff to try and, navigate to a place. But there's a certain point in the process when I'm finishing a mix where I have to be able to just kind of turn up the speakers and sit back and just feel a musical experience that I connect with, and it either happens or it doesn't,
Yeah.
And like that's the part that I think, people have to really trust in themselves and really get tuned in with. And I was very fortunate, that I started in the late 80s with the band that I was playing with, and then transitioned to doing other things, all through the 90s. And then late 90s was fortunate enough to meet up with some bands that became successful. And my instincts were translating to something that was the right time for what was going on in that time frame. It's all changed now, as it should. Music needs to evolve and things should change. And so my instincts are not really at the center of the bullseye of what's happening right now. And but for that era of time, from all through the 90s and into the 2000s, all I had to do is go in the studio and make something that I thought sounded cool, and other people would like it. Record companies would like it. Record companies would pay me for it. Radio stations would play it, and it all just was super effortless for me.
That you've hit upon a really, really interesting point there, which is to say that I've kind of straddled two different cultures. When I was 19, I started a band and was so into just the whole culture. Like we wanted to live like Pixies circa 1986. We wanted that whole life. We wanted being in a van, REM IRS years experience, just driving around doing that whole thing. And this is like 2015. Blink and everything's hip hop and everything's electronic. Yeah. And it's that culture seems quite old now. What do you do if the music that you've been gearing yourself up for suddenly becomes out of fashion? I'm guessing from what you were saying that you wouldn't advise people to just immediately try and put on a new suit and pretend you're the new thing.
I don't think that makes for a fulfilling life, and I've never personally, I never chased money. That I'm not motivated by money. If you want to make a lot of money, then you got to make music that is right in the center of what's popular. So right now, if you really want to make a lot of money, you're going to make pop music, you better learn about hip hop and electronic, music production. And, if you're really into it and you connect with it, you'll do great. That's great. But I had an interesting transition. So when, I started off playing in this sort of like prog rock band in the late 80s, this band called T-Ride. And then coming out of that, we toured and it wasn't as successful as everybody hoped. And so then I sort of transitioned to, you know what, I prefer the studio. I'm just going to stick to doing studio stuff.
Yeah.
And we had started with a client, I always had recording studios that I worked at that we built. There was the singer in the band, T-Ride, and I were partnered together, and we built these recording studios. They sort of progressively got bigger and better as things went along. And so once the band thing sort of wound down and I was just doing the studio, our best client at the time, this was in the early 90s, there was another round of this where rap music was massively popular. And we had this guy named Oscar Jackson, who was also known as Paris. He was like a real sort of political, like, it was very similar to Public Enemy, that kind of a rap band. And they call him the Black Panther of hip hop. He was in Northern California. He was a very bright guy, and had very sort of a lot of social commentary, and sort of politically informed lyrics and stuff like that. He was a cool dude. And so he was our best client. He was getting a lot of traction. And a major label gave him an imprint, and he was signing other artists, and there was just a ton of work there. And so there was a period of time from like around 1993 to 1995. I did nothing but rap music. I just worked for Paris. That's all I did. And I was super grateful for it. It was, amazing to have that like stable income at the time and be able to push things forward. I was paying off a bunch of debt that was left over from the band that I played in. And, but there was a certain point, like in the, around 95, when I realized, like, I am never going to be better than Dr. Dre at this. That's not going to happen. Like when I leave the studio to go home, I don't listen to rap music. I put Led Zeppelin on for my drive home and into the studio. That's what speaks to my heart, And I told Paris at a certain point, like, you should be working with somebody that is 100% invested in and passionate about rap music. Then you'll make the best work. You should be working with Dr. Dre. He was super talented, like, I'm just not that guy, like, I'm grateful for the work and I think you're awesome. But like, if I'm really honest, like, I don't think you're, I'm good enough. You should be working with somebody that's more invested in this. And I should be working on rock music. That's what I love. That's what I learned how to play. That's what speaks to me. And so I made that transition. I gave him time to be able to get situated with a new thing. It ultimately didn't work out great. He ended up trying to rob the studio, and that was not awesome. But then I made that transition, which was tough. Like, I was making no money for a period of time, very, very limited income, and just like put an ad out in the local magazines. There was a thing called Bay Area Music Magazine, like studio time for rent, I'll record anybody, and just started working with bands again. And I was just so much more passionate about that. And it didn't take that long. And all of a sudden I sort of just happened to cross paths with a band called Third Eye Blind, made some demos with them. And I crossed paths with another band called Smash Mouth, and I made some demos with them. And because I was so invested in that style of music and being able to capture the drums and mic drum kits, and I loved doing that, and guitar sound, like the whole thing was just so incredible to me, and I loved every second of it. I was doing the best work I could do doing that, even though I was living off of like microwave burritos that I was buying from a gas station around the corner, I didn't care, because I was doing what I really, really loved to do. And I was doing work that I think was actually more important when I was doing that. And so then, it didn't take that long for that to transition into those bands getting signed, them wanting to still work with me and carrying me across that threshold from being just a guy that gets hired by the hour to a guy that has his name on multi-platinum albums, No,
that's really useful, because one of my questions was going to be for there's going to be hopefully some younger people, some aspiring people watching this thinking, seeing you with albums under your belt that have sold and sold. And for example, I heard No One Knows every single time I went out when I was at college.
Yeah.
And some people will be like, well, I'm at A, you're at B. How do I get there from A to B with, as painless a way as possible? And it sounds like part of your answer is you have to just stay the course. You have to do what you really believe in and not get too panicky about not having a mortgage straight away.
Yeah. I think there are different ways to do it. I know folks that have done the intern route, where they start in a high profile studio where there's lots of high profile artists and high profile record makers in the building, and you're assisting them. That can actually be a faster path to get there. And so in a matter of a few years, you can make that transition from being an assistant to then working with more high profile stuff. And you learn those techniques straight away. You get to see somebody at the top of their game making, platinum records. I guess multi-streamed records. I don't know what you call it anymore. Yeah. Doing that. And so you learn that immediately. I took sort of a longer path where I was very self-taught. I never really interned in another studio. Super dedicated to it, and it's just basically all I ever thought about or did for a long period of my life, for decades. I started when I was a teenager, quite young. I got my first 4-track when I was like 13, 14 years old, and just never stopped recording. And so it's a long path to get there, and I think it's a little riskier because depending where you are, I think the two biggest factors that you have limited control over is your location, where you are, and what time frame you're in. Timing is really important. And so if I started now, today, doing the kind of production that really speaks to my heart, I would never be making a multi-platinum record. It wouldn't happen.
So is that what you see happening from now on for, say if we've got anyone who's like 21 years old and is like, I am longing for a return to, the days when a band like Nirvana would be the biggest thing on the planet, and that's the culture I want to live in. It sounds like you were saying you might have to hang up that dream and just do it any way you can.
It's never going to be like that again, and it shouldn't.
What's changed to stop it from being like that again?
It shouldn't be like that. Music is a dynamic creative process, and it should always continue to reinvent and evolve through time. Led Zeppelin was an amazing band. I love them. I still listen to it every day, but that's been done, It's been done. We don't need to do that again. We don't have to. It's cool to be influenced by it. I am, and I still love listening to it, and it still brings me extraordinary joy when I listen to that music. But people, I don't think music should still be trying to do that, almost 60 years later, or no, so almost 50 years later, it just doesn't make sense. And so, the music that's being done now that's really successful doesn't speak to me personally, but it doesn't mean that it's any less important or valid or creative or any of those things. I think there's really amazing creative things going on in the music. It all sounds the same to me because I'm not invested in it, and I can't identify all the really cool subtle differences between these tracks that makes one artist unique in one way versus another. Just like I think when a rap artist listens to rock music, it all sounds the same to him. It's all got drums and guitars, and like what's the big deal? It's all the same crap.
Yeah.
And so I think you can still have I think a really, really great life experience, and I think a better life experience if you're doing what you really love. If you really love Nirvana and you want to make that kind of music, and you can make it in a way that's important and meaningful, then it will have value in the world. You won't make as much money doing that than if you did the latest Drake record, right? Mm-hmm. That's just the reality of it. But to me personally, again, like I was never motivated by money, and I'd have been perfectly happy staying in my little hunk of shit studios. It was what it actually used to be called in Redwood City, making the music that I love. I'd be totally happy doing that. And,
so tell us about what happened when did things change for you? When did it go from being in the hunk of shit studio to something a little bit grander and a bit more, a bit more mainstream, let's say?
Yeah, for me, and I know it's different for everybody. For me, it was a very, very specific, very quick transition that happened. And so I had met both of those bands, Smash Mouth and Third Eye Blind, around the same time, and was doing demos for both of them. And they had kind of a different trajectory, but they ended up around being finished around the same time. So Third Eye Blind, we made demos. they shopped demos and got a major label record deal with Elektra Records. And then the band asked me to stay on to co-produce the record with the lead singer, Stephen Jenkins. And so I engineered, mixed most of the record, and then co-produced the record. And then Smash Mouth made demos, but they didn't get a record deal. They shopped it around. They didn't get a record deal. And Smash Mouth started off as like a ska punk band. Most people don't actually know that. And even though 99% of their first record was all ska punk. And so we did a bunch of demos. They didn't get signed. And then they came back to me and they said, hey, we just want to make a record and put it out ourselves. And I said, no, okay, cool, let's do it. And so, we just took the 5 or 6 songs we had already recorded another 6 songs, and then I mixed it all and made one record out of that. And so that record, the first Smash Mouth record, took 2 weeks to make, recorded and mixed. And one of the songs on that first record in the second batch of 6 songs was that song, Walking on the Sun. And so we finished the record for Smash Mouth, and I had finished the album. I'd been working on the album with Third Eye Blind all through 1996, through the second, we started in the summer, and that album took a long time. It took 6 months to make that record. Mm-hmm. And we worked on and off a little bit, but it was just a long process. And it was sort of intended to be that way. We recorded at multiple different studios, and we had a big budget, and we wanted to spare no expense and just have this extravagant. We wanted to make a big, unapologetic, rock record, and so we did that, but it took a long time. So I finished mixing that record right in the end of 1996, and then for anybody who's been through the process. Once you finish mixing an album, it takes months for it to come out. Right. So the record company gets it, you do artwork, you start setting up press, there's this whole process where you set up the release of a record, and it takes months. And depending on their release schedule with other artists, it can be pushed back even further. So that album ended up not coming out until months later. And so the Smash Mouth record, I finished that record in April of 97. And we finished the record, and we thought, okay, let's take it down to get mastered in LA. We took it to Bernie Grundman Mastering in LA, and we'll get it mastered, and we'll play it for some people and see if they can get signed. And so a couple of things happened. They started taking it to some record companies, and the singer of Smash Mouth was really good at networking. He made friends with anybody that could help the band. And so he made friends with the guy that did production work at K-Rock. Mm-hmm. And went over there and played it for this guy named Jim Pratt. And so he would do all the cool sound effects in transitions and stuff, and little bumper things and whatever. And Jim Pratt heard Walking on the Sun and said, "Hold on a second, I have to play this for the program director right now." Yeah. He walked into the next room. There's a guy named Kevin Weatherly. If you know anything about alternative music in the United States, he defined the program list for alternative music in the US. He was the guy. And went in and played it for him. And Kevin Weatherly said, I want to start playing this tonight. Wow. It's never happened before. And then at the same time, they were taking it to record companies, and every record company that they took it to was like, we want to sign this. And so Interscope was really, really aggressive. It's like, we're not going to let you leave. You have to sign with us. And so Interscope was insisting on signing the band. They actually had to tell Kevin Weatherly, please don't start playing the song yet. We're not ready. We don't even have an album cover. Please wait. Let us get our shit together, and then we'll give it to you first.
What's the worry? Is it that it catches some attention and then fizzles out before release?
Right. So, so songs have sort of an arc, of play on radio. So it'll build up and it'll peak, and then it'll sort of taper off. And if you don't have records on the shelves when that song is getting played 7 or 8 times a day on the station, you can miss your opportunity back then when people bought records. Mm-hmm. And so what ended up happening was the song Walking on the Sun and Semi-Charmed Life ended up getting released to radio at the same time. And they both went to #1 on alternative music at the same time, and were competing for that that position against each other. And so I just out of sheer luck, of meeting those bands, just sort of exploded into the popular music scene just out of nowhere. It was totally crazy. And so overnight, I went from being, kind of a locally known dude that could record some stuff to a nationally known guy where every day, for a while, I was getting calls from producer managers going like, "Hey, who are you working with? Do you need a manager?" Like it was totally surreal. And like the reality is once that transition happens, this is one of those catch-22 things. It's like, once that happens, like pretty much from that point forward, every time my phone rings to work on a record is because my name is on a record. Right. And so it's getting that first record that is visible enough to bring that, to start that momentum and get your phone to start ringing in that way. And, and I'm just super grateful for all of it. Once that momentum started, man, I worked 16 hours a day, at least 6 days a week for 20 years.
Wow. And so it follows the same distribution pattern as, all creative success. It's like a lot of zero and then 100 all of a sudden. And it can also, maybe in your experience, you can tell me if you've ever seen anyone do this. My suspicion, having not yet had any of that kind of success, is that it can be easy to fall off it if you don't know how to manage it.
Yeah, I think it can. I'm trying to think about that. I mean, most of the people that I know, that either came up through my world and I watched them make that transition. I can think of a couple of examples of how it's gone right and how it's gone wrong. I'll leave names out of this. And so, there was one gentleman that assisted me for a period of time and was very ambitious, super talented, and very business minded. And so he had like the perfect combination of qualities to really be able to capitalize on what I feel was really a gift. Like the guy is an amazing, gifted songwriter, and so. He made that transition, and even after working with me, it was a little bit of a slow climb for him, but he was very persistent and really believed in his musical sensibilities. And so it took another probably 5 years, and all of a sudden he was starting to work with more like high profile artists, people like Pink and, a bunch of Nashville artists. Like he was doing both pop and country stuff. And he parlayed that into having his own record company and a management company and like, way more successful than I ever what was or would be or whatever, like I just didn't have that kind of ambition. And sadly he passed away last year, but way too young. But there was no question that he was just going to continue to build. He was on the path to being an enormous music mogul, in the music business. He just had all the qualities to do it. There's another gentleman that's started off just assisting me, and then he's a great engineer and a mixer, and so he's continuing on and mixing for sort of higher and higher profile stuff, and doing amazing. And I think one of the things that the example that didn't really go well, there was a guy that I know who's also an amazing engineer, started off working on some very high profile stuff, huge multi-platinum records. And at a certain point, I don't even really know what motivated the choice to do this, but at a certain point, he fired his manager and thought, you're not really doing anything, like I'm doing all the work. Like what, why am I giving you all this money? This is stupid. And his career instantaneously went boop.
Wow. Just from that one manager not generating opportunity.
Yeah. And I think there are certainly good and bad managers out there in the world. Some maybe aren't really worth whatever they take. But the ones that are good are really worth it.
Yeah.
I had sort of a unique situation where I have a guy that is both my manager and a lawyer. He's my lawyer and manager both. Really professionally as a lawyer, but he decided to manage me as well. I'm the only producer he's ever managed, and I'm a kind of a hands-off producer because I have my own studio that I work out of. All you have to do is just put a band in there with me, and I'm just very self-sufficient, And some other producers, they need a lot of help, like finding a studio and putting the budget together and doing all this stuff. And there's just very little work to do once there's a band that's gonna come in and work with me. And so my guy Jeff Light has been amazing for me, but there's some real advantages to that. And like for Jeff, the guy that's represented me in the time when this was possible, he would ask for fees for what I do that I could have just never asked for. Like I just couldn't have ever conceived of asking for that much money.
Can you be
sure,
more specific?
He would ask for $500,000 for me to make a record.
Wow.
All in budget.
Wow.
I mean, that's a fucking lot of money.
It's pretty huge. What do you reckon what do you reckon the rate is, or like the top rate is that a producer has been, charging for making a record? Or maybe some really good examples.
Yeah, I mean, I peaked out at $500,000, like
that's
that.
Pretty good.
When early 2000s, like that's where it was. The music business was still healthy. It hadn't really been, or healthy in a different way. And so it was possible to do that. And I got that consistently, for a number of years. And it wasn't until we got into the 2010s when it really started to taper off, and It was like the realities of streaming and the loss of revenue and stuff really started to trickle down to the folks that work in the studio. It's like, no, you're not going to get that anymore. Like there's just not enough money.
Should we go a bit into that? I mean, you've had a career that straddled, let's say, what did you say? 1987 it started roughly, 86?
Yeah, in late 80s. Yeah.
And here we are, 2021. And if you time traveled from there to here, it would be an alien world in the music industry. What's going on? Are we going through a transition? Or is this the end result? I mean, I can't actually predict the future, but there's this constant debate going around in this office because our founders are 55, we're all 28 to 22 roughly, the rest of the team. So there's a debate that goes on saying this is wrong. How can we get Spotify to give more money to artists? And part of me thinks that the problem might not be withholding money. It might just be the model itself. But just tell me what you think.
Yeah, there's a bunch of things. I have a lot of feelings about that. We are the significant part of the transition has happened. Basically, the main trigger of change was this issue of not really being able to own. You can't physically own a recording of music anymore.
We're going to segue on to something else there later, but yeah, go on.
Yeah. Once it goes out there, everybody can have it. Generationless copies, it's out, and so people can get it for free.
Yeah.
And so that was the thing that triggered all of the change that we are now seeing the results of, that, music really lost its value as a medium, And so the Spotify thing, I think there's a couple things about that model that really, really needs to change. There's a lot of chatter about it on the internet. I'm not the only person that's waving this flag. But first of all, the reason that the deal is not good for artists with Spotify, and I know this because my lawyer manager is a lawyer for Spotify. And he was very much involved with all of the negotiations that happened with that company as it was starting. And what happened was that Spotify, in order to have even the slightest possibility of being successful as a music delivery, service, they're going to have all of the music that people like to listen to, or the majority of the music that people like to listen to. If you can't offer that, who's going to pay a subscription for a service that doesn't have the music you listen to? Who owns all of the music that people listen to? The 3 or 4 major labels. So like Universal Music, the Sony Group, the Warner Group, and whatever, some other stuff. And so Spotify had to strike a deal with those entities to be able to have access to their catalogs so they could be able to play all the music that people want. And the labels knew, like, your business doesn't work without our catalogs. And they just had Spotify over a barrel and just named their price. And so Spotify isn't getting a particularly great deal either, because they had no leverage in the deal. You know, it's not like record companies needed Spotify, you know. And so the deal was not extraordinarily great for the record companies and atrociously bad for the artists. So, you know, because the artists weren't even a part of that negotiation.
Can you elucidate for us a little bit of what an artist can expect from, you know, streaming? Can you survive on streaming?
Man, the numbers have to be big, real big. There's lots of information on this online. It's very easy to look up if you want to Google it. And I don't remember the numbers specifically, but unless you're getting hundreds of millions of streams on Spotify, I don't think it's something that you can really sort of like count on as making a living, you know?
So an interesting question I've had for someone like you who's seen both sides of it, who's been in the major success of the, let's say the old era, dare I say it. I had a suspicion that it was a similar distribution, as in, you know, if you're one of the top 100 artists, you're making money. But it sounds as if there was once upon a time a way to at least subsist without being one of the top 100. You know, you can sell merch, you can sell your own LPs, you know, pressed at tremendous expense to yourself. But if you can make a bit of markup, you can perhaps live. But,
absolutely, yeah. If you sold a few 100,000 records, you know, people would make money. You know,
but not a few 100 million, like you're saying.
Yes. Yeah. You could say sell a few 100,000 records. You don't have to be gold or platinum, and the record company would make their money back. You know, so let's look at this. It's like, let's see here. Let's do the math real quick here. So, you know, records used to sell about $15 a piece, right? And so let's say you sell 300,000 records. You know, so that's $4.5 million of gross income, you know, off of a record that just sold 300,000 copies. It's not even gold, you know?
Yeah.
And so from that, the record company would typically take 80%. So they've made, you know, $3.5 million off that. That's a good business model. There's a huge portion of that goes towards promoting it. So they'd probably spend $500,000 promoting it, or more, maybe $1 million promoting it, tour support, other things like that. But still, you're making $2 or $3 million off of a record that isn't even gold, you know? Mm-hmm. And so the artists, they make their, let's see. So what was it? 4.5 million, something like that. Mm-hmm. So they get their 20%. That's $1 million.
Not bad.
Not bad. You know, for an album. And that's not even gold, you know? And so it was a totally different thing. And I'm going through an interesting thing right now. So you know, you go on an audio thing, you think you're going to talk about, you know, microphones and stuff. And we're all talking about finance. But hopefully people are interested in this. But there's an incredibly illuminating thing that's going on in my life right now. So I'm going through a big transition right now. So I bought a building in the year 2000. You know, I turned it into Barefoot Recording. It's been my workspace for the last 20 years now, 21 years. And so I'm going to sell that building for a lot of reasons. You know, I'm going to move my whole thing to Vermont. I found a property out in Vermont that's amazing. It's exactly where I pictured myself being, you know, like in the second half of my life, you know, where I can be creative if I want to, or I can just hang out or whatever. It's just like this beautiful property. It's got its own river on it and a pond and a big field and hills. And, you know, it's just an amazing old farm with this big barn that I'm going to turn into a studio. So it's my dream. And so I bought this building in Hollywood. It's right at Santa Monica and Vine, in the intersection of those two streets in Hollywood. Very busy center of Hollywood type place. I bought that building in 2000 for $700,000.
Wow.
Okay. And at that time, making rock records, I was making almost $500,000 to make a record.
Wow.
Right. So all I had to do was make 1 or 2 records. I had more than enough money to buy that building. So now that building, if you do comps for the area, is worth $4 million. $4 million. I'm trying to sell it right now. It's being a huge pain in my ass, but I'm working on it. And then if I was going to get hired to do a rock record now, me or any other, rock guys, the budget to do a rock record, it's more like $150,000, $200,000, something like that.
Is that for the whole record?
For the whole record.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of guys that do it for way less than that.
Well, I imagine,
It's steady work, And because I would do all in budget. So a lot of guys that are just producing, you'll get maybe 30, 40, 50 grand to be a producer. And then the rest of the budget goes to a recording studio, to an engineer, to the mastering guy, to whatever, right? But all in budget, maybe 150, 200,000. And so, my studio that I'm trying to sell is set up to record bands, to record rock music, to record that type of music. The producers, the artists, all the people that are involved in making that kind of music now have nowhere near the income to buy that building.
Yeah.
Not even close.
Is that the pain in the ass that it's becoming?
Yeah.
Wow. And I imagine
really crazy.
Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, it's just one of these like tectonic changes in a whole industry and a genre in the industry. Here's
an interesting thing to me. I presume you worked on some famous records in that place over the last 20 years. Yeah. One thing I found when I visited America is stuff gets torn down real quick, stuff of historical significance, and I'm guessing that in itself isn't enough to preserve the space, because I'm guessing you'd have to, if you want to, get someone to buy it, because like you say, the people who need it, a purpose-built, properly, built sound place, can't afford it. Ergo, you'd have to sell it to someone who doesn't want it for that purpose.
Yeah, Hollywood is not a particularly sentimental town, and the reality is, you can throw a stone and hit a building where fucking Frank Sinatra recorded and, whoever else recorded. It's everywhere there. So people are just kind of, jaded to the whole thing. And the building that I own, it was an amazing studio before I bought it. It was called Crystal Studios, and it was like Stevie Wonder's place for a while. He did Songs for the Key of Life there, and it was like everything from Barbra Streisand to James Taylor to War to Jimi Hendrix to on and on and on and on. This amazing history. They had hundreds of #1 singles out of there, blah, 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 blah. Nobody gives a shit.
Wow.
They don't care at all.
It's interesting, actually, because that reminds me of when I was listening to the Russell Brand podcast. He was describing a time he was in the car with Tom Cruise and his whole family, and Tom Cruise was doing the "help me, help you" scene from Jerry Maguire. And Russell Brand says he looks around and is like, no one cares, because they live with Tom Cruise. It's not interesting to them.
Right. Right. Yeah.
So you're saying that Hollywood has such an accumulation and a concentration of this magical success and wealth and just everything that is actually kind of boring. It's not unique to any one place in Hollywood. Yeah,
it's certainly not. It doesn't have the same sort of special, significance that it would in other places, because it's just everywhere,
Yeah. So this is why some people are starting to move out of LA and move to different places like Austin, Texas, or whatever. I mean, I'm mostly thinking of Joe Rogan when I say that, but
Yeah, no, it's very true. There's a lot of people that are leaving. I'm leaving.
Of course,
Hollywood's an amazing place. There's incredible energy there. It was the perfect place for me to be when all I wanted to do was make records. That was just the fucking ground zero for me. Of where to be to make records. And I'm kind of retired at this point. I still do music and stuff, but I do it only when I just want to and feel like it. And I'm a new dad, and I got a 3-year-old son. And so, you know, my time is being sort of divided differently now than it was before, where there was no division. All I did was just music all the time.
Yeah.
You know? It was great, and I did that, you know. But there's a certain point where it's like, you know, how boring would it be for me to just make a bunch more records for the rest of my life? Let's try something else. Let's make a kid. Let's make a human being. Let's try that, you know.
Yeah.
So and so I need to always have that in my life. I think I would really go crazy if I didn't have access to a studio where I can go and be creative. And the place that I'm going to build in Vermont is unquestionably going to be the most indulgent, extravagant home studio ever, for sure.
I mean, this is. What do you think of Albini?
I love his work. He's made some amazing records, and I really respect his approach. You know.
Yeah. I don't know. I don't know how he built that studio, considering his whole thing has been refusing to ever take points on a record. You know, and
ethically opposed to it. Yeah, you know, he's a hardworking dude. You know, he's done a lot of stuff, and I think you can do it that way. And I you know, part of the beginning of this whole stream of consciousness is like, if somebody really wants to, you know, invest their energy and creative spirit into making Nirvana type music now in 2021, I think you can do that, and you still can make a living doing it. It won't be like, you know, mansions and Bentleys and stuff like that, but who fucking needs that? You know, like that's not anybody that thinks that that's really where happiness comes from. You got a lot of other shit to figure out first, because that's not where happiness comes from. You know, happiness comes from the inside. It doesn't come from outside stuff. And
it's like the skyrocketing heights of like Jagger and Richards, for example, from a financial or wealth perspective, are a side effect of how good they made people feel by obsessively pursuing that rock and roll music they loved.
Yeah, there's a lot of really interesting stories about this stuff too. You know, famous folks that, you know, were seeking fulfillment and happiness through success and validation externally, and when they got there and realized, I'm still not actually really happy or fulfilled, because they're trying to get it from the outside instead of finding it within themselves. That's when they really unravel. There's a pretty famous story about Richard Dreyfuss, a famous actor, when he finally won an Oscar. And he's like, okay, I've finally done it. Like, that was his big dream. When I win an Oscar, then I'll finally feel fulfilled and happy and validated in my life. And he realized he didn't, and he went on a big like bender and it totally unraveled, you know, because it wasn't the answer, and it never is, you know. Happiness doesn't come from shit like that.
Well, moments like that are often like the end of the story, aren't they? And then it's like it's the end of one story. Suddenly, you need a new one.
Yeah.
Is that what it's like when you? Sorry, go on.
I've seen that as well, where there's something very exciting about the potential of something. I've seen a lot of artists that have this extraordinary potential, but it hasn't happened yet. And everybody's like, it's going to be this, it's going to be that. They're going to be so huge. It's going to be blah, 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 blah. And everybody has this vision in their mind of all this amazing stuff that's going to happen. And sometimes it gets so overwhelming that the artist doesn't want to actually take the next step. They want to live in the potential, because once they take that next step, then the question gets answered. Like, is that actually really going to happen or not? They don't want the answer. They want to live in the idea that it's going to happen, you know? I
mean, this is exactly like, one of the reasons I'm laughing is because when we were in our band, you know, it's coming up on 10 years ago now. It's like every band, you know, sits in the car or the van or wherever and does what John and Paul did and said, where are we going? Top of the pops, toppermost of the poppermost. It's like you just psych yourself up every day. It's going to be so massive. And, you know, our singer, Dixon, I mean, he's just going to laugh at the fact that we used to just sit in his car till 3 a.m. sometimes after rehearsal and just being like dreaming of how amazing it was going to be when we became huge. And you must have seen so many people do that.
Yeah. There's a lot of it. And so, some people, have this sort of the strength and are brave enough to actually put it to the test and let that question be answered. The band I was in, the band T-Ride, like we were at least brave enough to make that leap, and go, let's really do it. We believe in this. We think it's going to be the biggest thing ever. Let's step out there and put it to the test. It wasn't what we expected. The timing wasn't right. We were a little too late with our thing. And so it didn't happen that way, but like, and that was actually a difficult transition for me. I mean, my whole world was ending. I joined that band when I was 16 years old, and it was like my whole world, everything I'd worked for in my life collapsed when that band.
Did you have that soul searching kind of pain? Like if it's not this, it can't be anything.
Yeah. And, but you turn, as long as you continue to approach your life, regardless of the circumstances, with this, positivity of I can still move forward from wherever I'm at. There's always an opportunity to take a step up from wherever you are. Things will get better. It doesn't really matter what's happened. What matters is what you're doing now and where you're headed now, and I feel like Tobey Maguire now. And so and for me, that band falling apart was could have been the best thing for me, because it created the opportunity for me to focus on being a record maker. And that's ultimately really what I, feel like I should have been doing,
Yeah. I can already see, looking at the time, that this could have, if we were doing this for real in the studio, this could easily go on for 3 hours, because there's just so much to talk about, just so much to ask. And, for that reason, I hope in the future, after some period of time, we can do this again.
Sure. We can do a part 2.
We'll do a part 2, but I've got some burning questions written down that me and Aaron wrote down before. And because, I mean, generally, like, I think, I take my inspiration for these things from Joe Rogan, which is why it tends to just wander and go in a direction you don't expect, because you put your stuff on YouTube all the time. We can see your Pro Tool sessions. I'm not going to get more out of you than you will from doing the work.
Right, yeah. I've already saturated that.
Well, it's just like, what I need to know better than I do by asking, I suppose. I mean, one of my burning question was just how the hell you turn a speaker into a microphone, for example.
Oh, yeah. It's super easy. You just connect a wire to, a speaker has a positive and negative leads on it, right? And just connect that to pins 2 and 3 on an XLR jack. Plug it into, your microphone preamp. You're good to go.
It's that simple.
It's that simple. It really
Amazing.
is. And so, I mean, here's the caveat. So now most speakers that are out there are powered. Doesn't work with powered speakers, right? You have to actually connect it to the actual speaker itself, the passive speaker component itself. And there can be some, impedance and loading issues depending on the impedance of the speaker and stuff like that. But most of the time, it all works out, and you're going for something that's weird anyway. So you just hook up the wire to it and plug it in and see what you get. I've done it with a lot of different speakers. It started with the NS10 speaker, but ultimately I was like, hey, that sounds cool. Why don't I try this fucking monitor wedge? It was it was a passive speaker, had a big 12-inch speaker in it. Let me try that. And so plugged a cable into that. Wow, that sounds cool. That ended up being the speaker microphone on the kick drum for all of the Queens of the Stone Age record. It was a monitor. Yeah.
Let's talk, sorry, go on. You've got more. And
then I did it with, I thought, wow, big speaker, get lots of low end. And so I did it with an Ampeg B15 15-inch speaker and used that as a microphone for kick drums. That sounds cool too. So, and then also on the Queens of the Stone Age record, I went to Radio Shack. I don't know if you're familiar with Radio Shack out in the UK. It's just like a cheapy consumer electronics store where you'd get like the cheapest, crappiest electronic stuff. And they had just little shitty speakers that you'd put in your car or something. I bought a little speaker that was about that big, maybe about 3 inches in diameter, and hooked a wire up to that, plugged it in. It was amazing on snare drums. Wow. And so that sort of like barky mid-range that you hear on the Queens of the Stone Age record, it's that little speaker on a snare drum.
That's a good question. So for young engineers starting out, for example, because I've seen a little bit of a session I'm going to ask you about in a moment, where I not too long ago, about an hour and a half, 2 hours ago, saw you soloing that channel, that exact one for this tiny crappy mic that's on the snare. I think it's on the snare. Sorry, on this session. And if this was me 3 years ago, I'd hear that and it's kind of a dissatisfying sound on its own because, it's just a texture, it's a flavor, it's a spice, it's not the main dish. But then I'd be like, I need to turn it up until I can really obviously hear it. Like, how do you get over that impulse to just relax and just let it sit in there, just flavoring the sound somewhat?
Yeah, for me, like, I definitely am hearing there's a finished snare drum sound that I'm trying to get, and there are these different components of that sound. There's sort of like the airy top end that sometimes comes from, the room sound that's maybe bleeding into the microphone from around it, and a little bit of the, the sizzle from the bottom of the drum, the snares on the bottom of the drum, that sort of airy top end. And then there's a more aggressive, bright attack to it. Then there's the sort of like mid-rangey bark to the snare, and then there's the low fundamental tone that has all the weight that sort of supports the rest of it. So it's not just this like piercing, brash sound, And so there was a certain point where I just started breaking it up into that spectrum of different components. And so I would use different sources to get those different aspects of the sound. And so I could just blend them together until it all added up to the complete thing that I wanted. And sometimes there are huge advantages to it. So, the brighter part of it, I could use a faster compression time, a faster attack on the compressor. So it wasn't so abrasive. It was bright, but it didn't like stab me in the ear hole,
Yeah.
And use a slower attack time for the lower stuff. So it had a harder transient and let more of the impact come through from the lower stuff. And so it just feels powerful when it comes. It has an impact to it that is not piercing, but it has a thunk to it,
That's interesting, actually. So it sounds like your snare is made of these constituent elements, and you're not just bussing them all to one thing and treating the bus. It's like you're every little mic, every element, you've got different ideas for attack release.
Differently. It's ultimately blended in with the rest of the drum mics, and then often, especially for aggressive rock stuff, then the whole drum kit would get compressed, and so those individual elements would get compressed together in the overall drum mix. But yeah, I think being able to compress things differently, is really, really useful. And now there's multi-band compressors that do it really well, so you can do it more with just one source, and you can do that. I also like incorporating distortion more in the mid-range and high frequencies, again, because it allows you to have more presence, a brighter sound, without having this really abrasive transient impact in there,
Yeah, I know what you mean. It sounds like the kind of we've only just got our first genuine Focusrite preamp analog. We were just going straight into the box before. Cool. And we had a condenser in Studio 2. The door slammed and my gain was too hot, and it just went really satisfying kind of thud with like crunch, but it wasn't harsh and hissy. I was like, how the hell did it do that? But that must be that analog distortion sound.
Yes, distortion is incredible. It's so good for music.
And a world unto itself is not just one sound.
Yeah.
So, well, that's good. I was alluding to before with the session I was watching is that, I've seen your, mix breakdowns on YouTube where you look at these different sessions and stuff. No one knows it's been taken down, but it still does the rounds on Reddit. Do you know why it's been taken down or why it's gone? I mean, it's your content.
Sure, yeah. Josh doesn't want his stuff out there.
Wow, why not?
He's always been more secretive about what they do. And there was definitely an era, in the 60s and 70s, like bands that I was into, like Led Zeppelin, there was a lot of mystique about those bands. Like those records sound otherworldly. And there was a lot of like, how is this happening? Like, I have no idea, how any of this was created. And I think Josh really values that for his band. And I respect that.
Not showing behind the wizard's curtain kind of thing. No.
And I think he loves the mystique. And it's his band. So he should be able to do it the way he wants.
Okay. This is because, obviously, well, like we say, for most people, no one knows is like the most popular track, certainly people my age group. You know, everyone knows it even if they don't know that they know it.
Sure.
Too many no's in this sentence already. And I feel like I'm listening to that, I'm like, those drums have got to be in a tiny room. But then if I set my drums up in a tiny room, it's like the snare makes no noise whatsoever. How have they done this? That's the kind of mystique you're talking about, right?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. And, you know, for that one, there's an interesting sort of, you know, paradox there because, you know, Josh always has been and is still in a place where he's very protective over all of that stuff and wants to maintain the mystique for his band. I totally respect that. I'm in a very different place with what I'm doing. I'm at a place where I'm excited about sharing all this information with people. I've really enjoyed doing it. I just put it up on YouTube. You know, I asked for at a certain point, I started asking for donations if people want to, but they don't have to. And I don't really care. I'm doing it because I'm having fun. Yeah. And so I do feel a certain part of, I feel a certain ownership over what I contributed to that record. And, you know, I recorded all of that shit, you know? And so I did really want to share that. And I felt like this was my part of it that I can share. But ultimately, that's not the way it works. So yeah. He had to take it down. So,
that's interesting, actually, because that speaks to the, you know, producer as artist, or as at least, you know, part of the artist ensemble, which I imagine was part and parcel of the old era, right? Because I hate to say old, but you know what I mean. So you're a band, it's 1980, whatever, you've rehearsed a bunch, you know how you want your record to sound, never been in a studio before and don't know how to manipulate the studio to get what you want out of it. Was that originally the role of the producer? It's like, I know how studios work, tell me what you want, I can make it happen.
Yeah, for sure. You know, bands traditionally were good at playing music, but like recording studios in the 50s and 60s were like, you know, a world of technical wizardry that, you know, like you couldn't just go to Guitar Center and buy recording equipment. Mm-hmm. Most of the studios made their own equipment from scratch, you know, like EMI, you know, Abbey Road Studios, they made their own equipment.
Oh yeah, all that legendary stuff that now Waves are going and trying to get the sound out of.
Yeah. Yeah. So, you know, to really have, and there's a lot of examples of that. In the United States, in the UK, all over the world in that era, because it really just wasn't this ubiquitous thing where it's just available to everybody. And so it would be extremely unlikely that a band would show up with any knowledge or experience at all about how any of that works. And so it really started in that realm. And, you know, if anybody that's really read the history of the Beatles, like, there was a separate entrance for the band to the studio than the people in the control room, you know? And like in Abbey Road, the control room was like up the stairs and you look through this big window down at the band, you know?
Yeah,
and like, go in there. You never even go in the control room. Like,
so for the benefit of the audience who haven't been there, Studio 2 Abbey Road, I think it is that the huge one where, so your control room is all the way up in the corner, there's a little window and you feel like being watched by a kind of focus group testing.
Yeah. And so it was such a different context back then. And that carried over for a long time. And actually the Beatles were really a part of that transition. There was a certain point where they were like, no, we're going up there. We got ideas too, and we want to do stuff, you know? And they really changed that whole paradigm.
And presumably helps that they had kind of George Martin to help them through that.
And they had the success behind them to be able to make those demands and say, you know, we just sold a shit ton of records, so we get to come in the control room now.
Yeah. The engineers at Abbey Road aren't going to tell them no.
Yeah. And so, you know, so they helped sort of spearhead that whole thing. And it's really cool now that, like, you know, people can literally with just a laptop, you've got a whole recording studio now, and you're really only limited by your own creativity. And back then, you know, it was very different. There were very real limits to it. You know, I mean, when I started out, the stuff that was easily available and affordable was a cassette 4-track recorder, you know, and there's definitely a limit to what you can capture on a cassette 4-track recorder. You know, this is not going to sound like a Def Leppard record. That's not going to happen. It's not going to sound like, Pyromania. There's no way.
Yeah, so imagine it's like 1978. It's like there's no way you're going to get, a Neumann, U49. You're never going to get good preamps. You're never going to, a whole desk, all the things you need to get the clean, silent kind of electronics, or as quiet as you can get them.
Yeah, there was very real technical limitations. And so, so it started out that way. And then there was a whole spectrum of how people approached it. There were one of the first producers that became more of an artist himself as a producer was Phil Spector,
right?
Where, he was writing the songs and defining the sound and creating artists.
Yes.
He would find somebody that had a voice and like, you're going to play this song and sing this way and it's going to sound like this, and making all of that stuff happen. He was the artist.
He was like the first time the producer was more akin to a film director, where you're listening to Phil Spector when you hear it.
Yes.
Yeah. So having the one on the inside the control room be the artist was not really heard of before that.
Yeah. Yeah. And then there's the other end of the spectrum, which is like Steve Albini, who's like, I'm here to record stuff, and I know how to capture amazing sounds. You are the band, and you be your band,
Yeah.
And that's been more his approach, where he really wants to protect and preserve the essence of what a band is,
Yeah.
And so it's cool.
So there's I've probably got hopefully time for one or two more questions, and I'm just gonna. My eyesight's bad these days, so I'm gonna cut out this bit from the interview where I hold the laptop close to my face.
Okay.
Many of these things we've actually addressed already. It's very unprofessional of me. I apologize. It doesn't normally happen.
All good. It's all good. I've named myself the worst YouTube host on YouTube for my shows because I'm terribly unprofessional on mine.
Yeah. I wasn't saying yes as in I agree. I think it gets probably...
You can agree. I think it's true.
No, it probably gets worse. But here's an interesting thing. Have you seen any of the stuff from House of Kush?
I have, yeah. I think he's doing great stuff. Like Greg
Scott.
Yeah, Greg Scott. He's good. He makes great plugins. So his AR1, which is like an emulation of a Verimute compressor, sort of like the Altec, modified Altec type compressor, is really good. I love that thing. I use it all the time. I just recently got his new thing, Silica. Mm-hmm. Which is like a combination compressor and distortion thing, which is right up my alley. Like, to me, compression and distortion should always go together,
Why is that? What's going on there?
Well, it's because both compression and distortion are both ways to manipulate dynamics, right? And there was a drive for a long time for people to try and get compressors to be cleaner and cleaner and cleaner and cleaner, because where they started out was incredibly, colored sounding. A lot of distortion was in early compressors, and they wanted to figure out how to get it out. And once they did, everybody realized, oh no, we should have that back. And then you have things like the Distressor was one of the first ones that actually had a distortion button on it, and sort of began the era of like, wait a minute, distortion was good. Let's bring that back in. And so there are two different ways to manipulate dynamics. And so distortion, at the end of the day, what it's doing is taking the loudest parts of a signal, and instead of just turning them down, which is what a compressor does, it converts them into overtone frequencies.
Yeah.
And so it gets translated into this harmonic series of higher frequencies. So that volume gets put in higher frequends.
It pushes it like horizontally instead of vertically up.
Yeah. So instead of just turning the waveform down, it actually, ends up starting to square off the peak of a waveform. And then all of a sudden you have these new overtones that are created. And so, for me, if you just take a signal and just turn it down, it sounds like what's literally happening, where somebody's getting yanked away from the speaker,
Yeah.
And there are times where I think, that is useful, but it's much less common for me than the translation of frequencies, And so when you incorporate distortion, the apparent volume stays more consistent, because even though that particular frequency is being reduced in amplitude, it's being replaced by other frequencies, overtone frequencies that relate to it, that maintain an apparent volume. And that's why, like an 1176 compressor, when you really mash a vocal through that thing, the vocal sounds like it's 1 millimeter from your face. You know, an incredible effect. It's so good.
Have you got some records you've done that on that we can then, the viewers can then go and listen to, so they know exactly what you're referring to?
All of them.
All of your records is 1176.
I have this one particular blackface, 1176. It's for anybody that really geeks out about them. It's a Rev D blackface 1176. So it's an original one. Or one of the vintage ones. It's probably from the early 70s. And that particular one is especially good for vocals. And so, it's on all of those records, especially when I got into the 2000s, if there's really aggressive vocal stuff going on. I'm trying to think of a good example. Of one of those types. Well, certainly all the Taking Back Sunday stuff has it all over it. The Good Charlotte stuff does. Definitely tracked the Queens of the Stone Age stuff with it. And then there's one really interesting example, which is a little less obvious. I made a record with this band, Nickel Creek. They're a bluegrass band. And there was one song where we were just having trouble getting an inspired vocal performance. I'll never forget this, because it was so immediate. And so Chris Thiele, he plays mandolin in the band, is one of the lead singers in the band. He was trying to sing the lead vocal to this song, Can't Complain, and it just wasn't like there was something about it that wasn't feeling inspiring for him. And I had him singing through on this song, what was it? I think it was my 251. So it was an Elam 251, probably a Neve preamp and the 1176. And so after a few takes, he starts off the song singing really, really quiet. And I decided, like, okay, I want to make this so, you can sing as quiet as you want and you'll never lose your own voice. And so I just cranked the input on the 1176. So even though he's singing quietly, it was just like 10, 15 dB of compression. And it literally like reached down his throat and pulled his voice out. It was just amazing, the result. And all of a sudden he could sing because his voice was just right there in his ears, so close up that every subtle little detail when he was trying to sing really soft was just inescapable. And it not only made the sound, it made the performance.
See, I love that, because that answers, a couple of our questions from earlier as well, because we're talking about the producer as artist, having to have a good artistic intuition. I know what you want, I can see what you're trying to get at, and I know how to achieve it with the tools. Not only that, but also trusting the ears, because you say you're watching the gain reduction meter on the 1176 and it's going, wow. And
yeah.
I'm quite a nervous person by temperament. So I watch that and I go, ooh, that's wrong. That's way too much activity. And I'm not listening. I go, wait, does it sound right?
Right.
Sounds
and
right.
That's a little bit of a dangerous game to play, because you cannot undo compression. There's no undo button there. You make a bad EQ move, you can probably, carve your way out of it. But when something's over compressed, there's no undoing that. So,
well, what do you mean by this? Because obviously I'm thinking in a digital paradigm, I could just turn the plug-in off. But do you mean once you've baked the mix, once it's cooked?
I'm saying, yeah. So,
tracking compression.
Yeah. So when that vocal was being recorded, that compressor was on the signal being recorded onto the tape machine. That project was all recorded to tape. So, yeah. And so, yeah. So if you put it on there before it goes into your computer, you can't take it off, you know?
Yeah. Is that what you do? Do you do tape and then into Pro Tools?
I do, yeah. I have this setup where I have a bunch of preamps coming in, and they normal to directly to the inputs of my converters, my A to D converters. And then I can also jumper them so they get multed and go to a tape machine with equalizers and compressors and all of that stuff. And so I capture two versions of it in my computer. There's the just clean preamps, and then there's what I consider to be sort of like the finished pre-mixed version, which goes through EQ, compression, and a tape machine, and then it gets captured in. And so the cool thing about this new process for me, I've been doing it for I don't know, since last 5 or 6 years, something like that. The way my stuff is set up is I can capture in the raw preamps and then have the raw mic preamps send back out and go through that chain of the EQ, compression, and tape machine, and then monitor that back, so I can get all my settings while I'm playing back something that I recorded. And so people don't have to be in the room just out there, you know, playing the drums forever while I'm EQing and geeking out on stuff, you know. And so then once I get those settings, I switch it over. So now the preamps are going directly to all of that stuff, and it all gets captured, you know, in there.
Brilliant. I've got 2 more technical questions, then I'll let you go because you've got a building to sell. So
I do.
And the questions I'm going to ask are basically to solve disputes within our business. So because, you know, you have to get purchases signed off, and often when, you know, you're confronting your higher ups and saying we need to spend this money, they're saying, why? What does it do if we spend that money? You know, we've got at the moment Genelec 1070s. Do you know the ones I mean?
I believe so. Yeah, I don't know that specific model number, but I know Genelec speakers. Yeah,
they've got you know, they're kind of nice and. Hang on a minute. Nice and flattering, kind of, you know, good for producing sound.
Sure, yeah.
Kind of
Genelec are fun to listen to. Yeah.
Right, and that's what I was worried about. They're quite flattering to the sound. Mm-hmm. I want a pair of NS10s. What's good about NS10s?
Oh boy,
we don't have time for this.
NS10s do work. I spent a long time trying to get away from them. I would not recommend going down that rabbit hole.
Why is that?
Because they are limiting at a certain point, you know, and a lot of the stuff that, you know, of mine that people may be excited about, you know, was done with NS10s. And there is a thing about them that really works. You know, it definitely makes you work hard. They're very mid-rangey sounding speakers. And so it will compel you to, you know, put a big smiley face on everything, add a lot of extra low end and add a lot of, you know, extra high end and stuff. And, you know, I think there was a time where that made sense, and it really, really worked for a long time. But, you know, the low end of modern records is very, very different now. I don't know that you could use NS10s without a sub for sure, because they start to roll off at about 80 hertz. Yeah. That's all you get, you know?
And just purely inaudible at like 40.
Nothing there, zero. Yeah. So, you know, so in that aspect, again, it worked better, you know, in a time where people weren't fucking around with 40 hertz, you know? Yeah, and now it's like, you know, driving
it's all there.
Yeah. And so it would be tough to use NS10s by themselves.
But I'd probably have them as a pair of B monitors, you know, my B speakers.
Yeah. I think, you know, I had that for a while as well. But if you have a pair of modern speakers that are really more flat all the way across, and you switch to the NS10s and your mix all of a sudden sounds like this, it's not really that helpful.
You're just going to remix the whole thing.
Yeah, it's such a different perspective that I think it's kind of disorienting. People still like them. I'm sure people are still getting good results out of them. I'm not saying it's impossible, but I spent a long time, you know, I got sort of stuck with them using these NS10s and these Uri 813 large format monitors. They have 2 15 low frequency drivers and a horn. And that's what I used for a long time. They're great up to a point. And there's a certain point where there's just amount of distortion and there's inaccuracies in the frequency response that become limiting. And I got as far as I could with those, and then there was sort of like a ceiling where like there's a level of detail that I just cannot get from these speakers.
If we could only afford like one pair of near fields, if you've got like a starting out producer, what would you say? Like these are your best bet?
Man, that's tough. Because the ones that I use are stupid expensive, and I don't want to.
No, I can guess.
Really, elitist, you have to have these. But
it's like Hans Zimmer speakers are like 30 grand, I think. So
yeah. So the ones that I use are made by this amazing, brilliant guy named Jürgen Strauss. I stumbled onto them when I went to Switzerland to install an Undertone audio console in a recording school in Switzerland, and I heard the speakers and I was like, whoa. I was actually in the midst of mastering a record at the time and listened to this stuff, and I was like, this is what I want things to sound like all the time. This is really what it should be, Yeah. And he just hears things exactly the way I want to hear my music. And they're brilliant. They're passive monitors, so you have to have a power amp. There's no adjusting them. There's none of that. And he just took the time to set up the passive components properly, so everything just feels effortless and accurate and musical. I love them so much. So they're called Strauss Electroacoustic. I can't recommend them enough. They're actually more accessible in Europe than they are in the States because he's in Switzerland. So he has these small ones, the NF3s. They go down to about 50 hertz, and they just sound amazing. And they're really what I always wish NS10s actually sounded like, because they have that passive speaker thing where they're not hypey, and so it's not like what you're describing with the Genelecs, where they're really fun to listen to. And I had that experience with Genelecs where you're mixing along and you're just thinking like, man, I'm fucking awesome at this. And then you go and listen to it on something else and you're like,
Yeah. Always.
What the hell happened? And that's just what it was for me. And I know a lot of people get great stuff out of Genelecs. They work awesome. People love them. That's great. Boy, did they not work for me. I just felt like they were lying to me the whole time.
Yes, that's exactly what I get, and that's why I'm looking for a good pair of more representative near fields. But so
the other thing that I would recommend when I needed just a quick, more affordable pair of speakers to throw up in a little temporary setup that I have in Vermont, I got the Atom T8Vs. It's their cheap line of speakers. It uses their same cool, whatever that ribbon tweeter is that they use. And, they just use slightly less expensive materials to build it. They're unbelievably affordable. I think a pair of them is like $700 or $800. They go down to like 35 hertz or something. So there's plenty of low frequency information there. And they've been great,
Well, that's really, really useful. And, of course, super generous of you to just dole out info like this. And then,
Sure.
The second dispute I need you to settle for me at work, because, I've got my FD saying, why do we need to pay for acoustic treatment in the mix room? And why should I explain it? I'll just get an engineer who, used to make $500,000 a record. Because we've got, a window there. So when I clap, I get flutter and I'm trying to mix in this room.
Yeah. No, this is the most overlooked thing, I think, in engineering and mixing, that you could have a pair of Hans Zimmer $30,000 speakers, and if you have them in a room that is not treated properly, they're worth exactly $0. They're worth nothing, because the room has more influence over how those speakers sound than the design of the speakers themselves. And that's why I'm fine using a pair of, $700 for a pair Atom speakers in my little sort of temporary setup, because I know how to treat the room right. And, room treatment is not super easy. You kind of have to really commit to it. The toughest thing to do is to fix the low end. And that's the part that is the most influenced by the room and the most difficult to manage in the room. And I'm going through this now because I'm designing and building a new studio in Vermont. And I went through a whole journey with it when with the control room at Barefoot Studios, because that room was not designed great and was not treated great, and I had to figure it out myself. I think I highly recommend for treating low end in spaces like that. Tube traps are a very quick and easy way to do broadband low frequency absorption in a room. There are people on the internet that sell panels that are supposed to be low frequency absorbers. They're not. There's a rule of thumb that for the type of material that people use for treating acoustics in a room, like if you're using this, mineral wools type stuff, like rock wool or something on the wall, that you need a quarter of the length of the waveform in order to be able to absorb it with that material. So a 60 hertz waveform is probably about 16, 17 feet long.
Wow.
So you need a quarter of that length of that material to actually absorb that frequency.
So just a 4-foot panel.
4 foot deep against the wall. Nobody's going to do that. And nobody really tells you that. They sell panels that are 4 inches deep and go, this is a bass trap. It's not.
Or a 7-inch, the max, it's like, this is a super bass trap.
Yeah, it's not.
So what do we do? What people like us?
The most efficient that I found that is more obtainable is tube traps. So you can get a tube trap and put it in the corner where all the low frequencies are concentrated. That's anywhere from 12 to 14 inches in diameter, and you'll absorb a good amount of low frequencies in the room. And I tune rooms with a sine wave sweep and a microphone, and so I can see all the detail of what's going on the low end, and it can be insane what's happening to your low end in your listening position, where from one peak to another peak is literally like 20 dB. One frequency is 20 dB louder than another frequency. How the fuck are you going to figure out your mix with shit like that going on,
Yeah, we did the...
huge problem. And so when you put tube traps in the corners in your room, you'll literally watch those peaks just go boop, get closer to each other. Because that energy in the room that is reflecting back into the sound that's coming out of the speaker and out of phase and causing peaks and cancellations, it just gets reduced the more absorption you have in the room. So my approach to a room is I like to be anechoic in the low frequencies, basically no reflections as much as possible. It's very difficult to do because presumably you need a hard floor to sit and walk on, so you can't put 4 feet of anything on there, But if you've seen an anechoic chamber, it's literally like this box inside a room where all 6 surfaces have these giant acoustic rams, these big pyramids of, absorptive material. And so anechoic in the low frequencies, diffusion in the mids and high frequencies. In my new place, I'm going to experiment with a new product. This is all... I've become friends with this guy, Jürgen Strauss, who makes those speakers, and he's very generously helping me with designing my new room. And it's like having the Einstein of acoustics helping you with your control room. He is unbelievably brilliant, and I'm so grateful that he wants to help me. And so he told me about a new product that was developed in Germany that is only 6 inches deep. And he's telling me, I haven't actually used it yet, but I'm gonna experiment with it with my next place, that it's an open window, what they call an open window, which means no reflections. It's basically like cutting a hole in the wall down to 60 hertz with 6 inches of depth. I don't even know how that's possible, but they're claiming that that's actually what's happening. If that's true, that's the thing to use.
That's the holy grail has finally arrived.
That's it right there.
Do you believe? Sorry.
Dabble diffusion as much as you want on top of it.
Yeah. So it sounds like from what you're saying is that the low end is the hardest demon to fight out. It's like you can treat mid-range reflections dead easy with stuff.
That's easy. You can throw up some blankets or foam or whatever, and that stuff, like the flutters on the window that you have. If you just put some curtains, just pull the curtains when you're mixing. And that it'll fix that. That stuff's easy to deal with. The low frequencies because it's a lot of energy, very long waveforms, and so it takes a lot to absorb all of that energy, and it's not easy. So
wow, that's definitely that's definitely gonna probably made the debate go on longer and harder now. So thanks.
Yeah, but get yourself a good, a flat microphone, like any one of the Earthworks microphones. Get a piece of software like Fuzz Measure or Room EQ Wizard that will graph the frequency response in room and see what you're hearing. That was the total revelation for me.
Well, that actually really helps because we've got the SonarWorks microphone.
Oh, great! Yeah, I've been using that in rooms where for quick setups. And where I needed to fix it really quick. SonarWorks is awesome.
You like it, yeah.
Yeah, and the latest revision of it is better because it gives you more control over how it's ultimately tuned. Instead of just making it flat, I like a lot of extra low end in my monitoring. It's just funner to work, and so now it lets you do that. And I just retuned the speakers in the room, in the studio that I'm selling with SonarWorks. It sounds amazing in there. You can totally crank it up. Super fun.
That's really good to hear because we, got SonarWorks as our first thing. And, we've got I think we've got a subwoofer under here. We've got an untreated corner over there. We had half-treated corner up there. And again, no absorption really to speak of anyway. Again, some rock wool that's about 3 inches deep. And so SonarWorks, produced the graph. The report says what your mix position is like. And there was, I think, an additional 12 decibels of everything below 100 hertz.
Oh, cool. Well, that's actually not a bad thing to have, because, ultimately it'll give you more headroom, and that happens when you back speakers right up against the wall. You'll get that lift in the low end. I actually don't mind it that much because I like lots of low end, but yeah, if you're on the right path, it sounds like you're using the right tools. So I'm sure it'll come together.
Great. Well, thank you for the time. Again, I've said it before, there's so much more we could go into. And so we'll get back in touch. Hopefully we can do this again.
Sure. We'll find a time. We'll do part 2.
Great stuff. Well, thanks very much. Have a great day. Have a great time selling the building and setting up a new place.
All right. Fingers crossed. Here we go.